You're watching Euronews Tonight. I'm Mariam Zaidi and these are the headlines this hour. The EU's top diplomat Joseph Borrell calls Russia's blockade of Ukrainian grain exports a real war crime as foreign ministers meet in Luxembourg. Preparing for the worst-case scenario, Germany announces plans to boost its gas storage for winter, but also turns back towards coal to meet its energy needs. After failing to secure an outright majority in parliamentary elections, the scramble is on to win over new allies for France's President Macron and keep his plans for reform on track. And as the world marks World Refugee Day, we'll take a look at the unprecedented number of people displaced by the unprecedented number of crises this year. Good evening. The EU's Foreign Affairs Chief Joseph Borrell says Russia is committing a war crime by blocking food exports from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. With the bloc's foreign affairs ministers gathering in Luxembourg, Borrell appealed to Moscow to lift the blockade or risk exasperating the global food crisis. Borrell said there's a risk of famine in the world, especially in Africa, as a consequence of an increase in food prices coupled with an ongoing energy supply shortfall. He also defended EU sanctions against Russia, saying they were not to blame for the food emergency. Well, let's cross over to Brussels and speak to Maeve McMahon, who's been following the story. Maeve, good to see you there. So this morning, Borrell called the Russian blockade of Ukrainian exports a war crime. What more have foreign ministers had to say?
Good evening, Mariam. Well, Joseph Borrell, the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief, not mincing his words there, calling a spade, saying that the Russian President Vladimir Putin was accountable for what he called this raw war crime for blocking 20 million tonnes of grain and not giving access to people who are waiting for that food, who are reliant on that food coming from Ukraine across the globe. He said that Vladimir Putin was ultimately responsible and very much accountable, that you couldn't use the hunger of people as a weapon. But what he also used his press conference to do was to make sure that the message wasn't out there that the EU and the European sanctions were to blame for this global food crisis and insecurity. Because, of course, we heard from African leaders that he's been conversing with that it is, in fact, those European sanctions that are to blame. But he today said that was not the case. He'd be sending, quote, comfort letters to African nations and to economic leaders in order to make sure it was crystal clear that it wasn't these sanctions. You can see Joseph Borrell between a rock and a hard place, really, because on the one hand, he has ministers as well inside that room in Luxembourg today, especially the Polish minister, calling on the EU to go a step further, in fact, to go on for a seventh package of sanctions. But on the other hand, he's being blamed for the global food insecurity and also the cost of living crisis. If you look at here in Belgium today, thousands of people taking to the streets, blaming those sanctions and blaming inflation for the fact that they just can't afford to go shopping even anymore and they've no money left in their pockets.
And Maeve, it's also an important week for Ukraine and their European ambitions. Are there any signs in Luxembourg that Ukraine is ebbing closer to securing this EU candidate status at this week's EU summit?
Well, that was a huge topic of conversation today in Luxembourg because, of course, EU heads of state and government will be meeting here in Brussels on Thursday and Friday to discuss that very opinion that came out of the European Commission last Friday. A recommendation from Ursula von der Leyen and her Commission to support Ukraine and Moldova, but not yet Georgia, to be candidates for EU membership. And we heard lots of welcoming words today from ministers saying that this would be very symbolic and it would give a morale boost to Ukrainians who've been dying with the EU flag in their hand. And Joseph Borrell, the EU Foreign Affairs Minister, was also very supportive of the move. Take a listen now to what he had to say.
That the European Council later this week should send a signal that we start the preparation for the European integration of these three countries. This is a powerful signal. It should be heard not only in Ukraine, not only Moldova and Georgia, as a manifestation of our strength and unity and support to these three countries, and most especially to the one who is being aggressed by Russia.
But whatever happens at that EU summit, Ukraine's membership talks will not start overnight. It will still be a long road ahead. There'll be still hurdles to jump for Ukraine and Moldova, and of course Georgia. All EU member states will then have to ratify the kicking off even of the negotiations, and then the tough talks will begin, and an accession treaty will have to be drafted. But if you look at the Ukrainians, they say they have 70% of the work already done, and they're ready to tick all the long list on all the boxes they have to do in order to get what they need to do in order to get that membership of the European Union, something they really want.
They do indeed, and definitely a long road ahead for them. Mabel McMahon, thank you as always. Well, intense fighting is continuing on Ukraine's eastern front as defence forces look to thwart Russian efforts to seize full control of Severodonetsk. Elsewhere, Russia has stepped up airstrikes in and around Kharkiv. Authorities say 3 children were injured, but Ukrainian troops have made steady progress in the largely Russian-controlled region of Kherson to the south. Local authorities claim that forces have advanced along the Dnieper River, destroying key Russian military stores. Well, let's now bring in Samuel Romani. He's Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Mr. Romani, thanks for joining us on Euronews tonight. Now, the battle for Severodonetsk looks to be coming to an end. But where do you see Russia now pivoting when the city does perhaps finally fall?
Well, first of all, it's not a guarantee that Severodonetsk is going to fall extremely quickly. It's obvious that they've gotten control over 70 to 80% of the city, according to Ukrainian estimates, but Ukraine still controls the key industrial zone, and there's still a long battle in the Azov chemical facility, which is going to be a smaller scale version of the saga that we saw at the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. So Severodonetsk is not gone, but the next step is going to most likely to be Lysychansk, which will lead to the fall of Luhansk, and then crossovers in Donetsk, Odessa, where they launched 14 missile strikes around today, and of course Kharkiv.
Now, you mentioned the word saga there. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, he's warned, of course, that the war in Ukraine could last years. Is that your take then?
Well, my take is that it's going to last a very long time because even the Ukrainians are admitting that Russia's got the financial capabilities and the military wherewithal to carry out this war for another 1 to 2 years. A lot of the predictions that began in late March that Russia was running out of the kind of missiles and munitions that it would need to sustain the war in the long term haven't seemed to have panned out. Equally, the Ukrainians are not going to concede any scenario of which they lose substantial amounts of territory, like Luhansk and Kherson. They're going to try to recapture those territories with a counteroffensive in July or August with new Western weaponry. So the Ukrainians will be launching a counteroffensive, the Russians will be continuing their expansionism, and the result is a war that could definitely last years.
So can you see Russia sitting down for any sort of peace talks or negotiations?
Not at this moment in time. I think it would probably take them being concerned about a tangible Ukrainian counteroffensive to come back to the table. Because right now, the Russians are feeling ascendant. They feel as if they've gotten the upper hand in Luhansk, and then they can cross the Seversky Donetsk River, go into Donetsk, and then take over all of Donbass, and then complete the liberation of Donbass, which is what Dmitry Peskov and other Russian officials have said was the core goal of the operation. So right now, the Russians are almost smug and confident about their position, so they probably aren't willing to engage in talks. But if the Ukrainians manage to gain a meaningful counteroffensive, get the kind of weaponry, artillery, even fighter jets down the line that they need, and the Russians start stalling in Kharkiv or Odessa, or if there's a hidden twist in Severodonetsk, which delays their capture of Luhansk, then we can see maybe the Russians talking about dialogue again.
So if this potentially is such a long, protracted war, how much more long-term military, political and economic support do you think Western leaders can offer Kiev?
Well, the main thing is that the Western leaders stay the course. I mean, Boris Johnson had an important point when he was warning of Ukraine fatigue, because that is possibly setting in as the Ukraine crisis is linked to rising food prices, linked to rising fuel prices. There's questions even amongst 30% of Americans in a recent Fox News survey about why are we giving money to Ukraine when we could be using that money to develop our own country. It's a midterm election coming up later this year in the States, a presidential election after that. So the main thing is that Western leaders keep their resolve and resist those kind of populist inclinations that might take them away from supporting Ukraine. But I think the movement in general still seems to be towards more howitzers, more AEPCs, more artillery, at a slower pace than Ukraine would want, but the weapons are streaming in, and that's going to be important for Ukraine as it tries to recapture lost territory and keep Russia from annexing Kharkiv and Odessa.
Okay, Samuel Romani, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on the programme tonight. Thank you so much. Now, Germany has announced its latest steps to boost gas storage levels in preparation for the next winter season, over fears Russia could reduce or even completely halt supplies. Russian state-controlled gas exporter Gazprom has cut deliveries by more than 60% in recent days. Germany's economy ministry says new measures to store gas will mean an increased reliance on coal-fired power plants. The move marks a turnaround for the ruling coalition, which vowed to wind down its coal usage by 20 to 30%. Well, for more, let's now cross over to Kate Brady in Berlin. Kate, so with the risk of supply shortages of gas, can Germany get its levels up in time for winter?
Well, that is the big question. As you say, there's so many factors at play right now. Of course, Germany has been trying to reduce its dependency on Russian gas since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, something that critics had been calling on Germany to do for years. On top of that, as I say, the gas storage facilities here in Germany are also down to just 57% now, something that Robert Habeck, the Vice-Chancellor and German economy minister, who's said that these coal plants are going to be fired up again, he said that's just simply not going to be enough to get Germany through the winter. So, of course, Robert Habeck, the Vice-Chancellor, being a Green politician as well, this is a particularly hard measure for him to swallow, the fact that Germany is planning on firing up more coal plants again to really, fill that gap that's been left by these gas shortages. But there are some other measures on the table as well. There's talks of a gas auction that would be aimed at huge industry. So we'd see big industry here being financially recompensated if they indeed reduce their gas consumption. And of course, consumers will be directly affected as well. There's even talk of a cap on domestic heating. So it really seems that nothing is off the table right now. And the German government is certainly scrambling to do everything it can to make sure that Germany can see itself through the winter now with these reduced gas supplies.
They definitely do seem to be scrambling. But for Germany, Kate, it seems like it's one step forward, two steps back, with them leaning back onto coal. Isn't this a bit of an embarrassment, though, given the EU Commission has just recently unveiled its Repower EU plan to really transform the bloc's energy system and move away from fossil fuels?
Absolutely, and as you mentioned already, this government, this three-party coalition government, has indeed pledged to phase out coal-fueled energy by the end of 2030. And this is one of the huge concerns that's been voiced not only by environmental groups, but most recently by the UN as well, that climate protection pledges could indeed be jeopardised by countries like Germany trying to find new sources of energy. But Germany has really got itself in a rather special, sticky situation, if you want to call it that, because of course we know, compared to some other countries, some other European neighbours as well, Germany has really underinvested in recent years, particularly in renewables. So this situation that Germany finds itself in now is something that critics have indeed been warning about for years. It's worth pointing out as well, let's not forget that Germany is also planning on phasing out the nuclear power plants here in Germany by the end of this year. So the situation right now very clearly is underlining once again this huge challenge facing so many countries right now when it comes to balancing those really three important factors when it comes to energy. Security of energy, the social impact, of course consumers are already feeling the pinch and seeing those energy prices rising here in Germany like across Europe, and then of course, not least of all, the impact that has on climate. So it really is an uphill battle here in Germany right now, and the government is already sensitising, if you will, trying to make the public more aware of what might be to come and how they can already reduce their energy consumption through a new national campaign, which I have to say isn't all that visible just yet, at least here in the German capital.
It definitely does seem like, as you said, a special sticky situation for Germany. Kate Brady, thank you. Now, Emmanuel Macron's Ensemble alliance has lost its absolute majority in the French National Assembly just 2 months after he was re-elected as president. In France's parliamentary elections, Ensemble secured 245 seats. far below the 289 needed for a majority. They were followed by the left-wing coalition NUPES, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who grabbed 141 seats in Sunday's vote. And Marine Le Pen's far-right party, the Rassemblement National, celebrated a historic breakthrough by obtaining 89 seats, jumping from the 6th to the 3rd biggest party. Well, our international correspondent Annelise Borges joins us now to rake over the aftermath of the French parliamentary results. Annelise, always good to see you. So Macron has fallen short. So where does he go to next?
Well, the next few days will be very interesting here in France. Emmanuel Macron's camp, however, insists they will just forge on. Speaking shortly after those results were announced, the Prime Minister here of France, Elisabeth Borne, said that they are already negotiating what she described as a majority of action on behalf of the stability of the country and, of course, to be able to push through some of the ambitious reforms Emmanuel Macron has planned. But, of course, that won't be easy. He will either have to cobble together some sort of support for each piece of legislation, or he'll have to negotiate a more permanent base of support. And many political analysts here in this country are suggesting that the most compatible ally would be the Conservative Party, the Republican. But the leader of that party has already come forward saying that they will not negotiate with the government, that they will remain in the opposition. So basically, Emmanuel Macron has two options from now on, if indeed he is not able to negotiate a better solution and a more permanent base of support. He will either have to negotiate through, to govern through what the French have learned to call the 49.3, the 49.3. That's an article of the Constitution that allows for the Prime Minister to ram through legislation without a parliamentary debate. But that, of course, is just a temporary solution because within 24 hours, if a majority in Parliament decides that the legislation adopted by the Prime Minister is not compatible with France, they can overturn it. Another option, of course, if there is a major political crisis, a major deadlock in Parliament, Emmanuel Macron could call for new elections. But that will take some time. That will take at least a year. So it's going to be very interesting to see where the governing group of Emmanuel Macron goes to next. Some analysts are, in fact, playing the whole thing down, saying that people here in France, leaders here in France, have governed with a minority before. The only condition for that to happen is that other political forces don't unite against the government. And of course, with the two political forces in Parliament now being the far left and the far right, that is very unlikely to happen.
So tough times looming potentially for negotiations for Emmanuel Macron. Let's come to Marine Le Pen and her party. They're now the third largest bloc in Parliament. What does this then mean for French politics going forward, Annelise?
Oh, this is a historic moment for Marine Le Pen's national rally, jumping from 8 seats to 89, becoming the third largest force in France right now, political force in France right now, and able to form a parliamentary group. That means they get more speaking time, but also more weight on the political debate within the walls of the National Assembly, but also beyond that institution. Earlier today, the leader of the movement, Marine Le Pen, has put rather bluntly what this all means for the administration of Emmanuel Macron. Take a listen.
Will Emmanuel Macron be able to do what he wants? No. The answer is no. That is to say, I think that retirement at 65 is a buried reform, as well as a whole series of other measures that Emmanuel Macron wanted to put in place and which in reality were toxic for the French people.
Marine Le Pen, who has been celebrating this historical victory for her party, a victory that will also mean a financing boost for the national rally. They will get about 10 million euros a year for the votes that they have managed to secure. That will certainly be welcome in a party that has some 24 million euros in debt.
Changing times indeed for France. Annelise, thank you. OK, well, France wasn't the only country voting last weekend. Spain's Conservative People's Party won a historic majority in the regional elections in the region of Andalusia on Sunday. Mario Bodin reports.
A historic win for the right wing in the Andalusian elections. Throughout Sunday night and into the early hours of Monday morning, supporters of the Partido Popular in Seville and several other Andalusian cities celebrated a victory with an absolute majority. The Popular Party has obtained the best electoral result in Spain's most populated autonomous community. Juan Manuel Moreno's candidacy has managed to oust the Socialist Party from what was its own fiefdom for more than 35 years.
Andalusia is going to have 4 years of prosperity, of progress, of improvement, of moving forward, of continuing to manage the interests of Andalusia with honesty, transparency, moderation and serenity. We're going to do it for 4 more years.
The Andalusian right won 58 of the 109 deputies, an absolute majority that exempts them from having to make a pact with the extreme right of Vox, which won 13% of the votes. The left-wing parties, led by the Socialists and followed by 2 other candidates, suffered a drop of 13 deputies compared to 2018. The result is a boost for the right and a spur to unite forces on the left in the run-up to the 2023 Spanish general elections. Mario Bowden, Euronews.
This year, war in Ukraine and other conflicts has seen the number of forcibly displaced people surge to its highest level in years. David Morricone reports.
The refugee crisis provoked by the war in Ukraine has refocused attention on the plight of displaced people as the international community marks World Refugee Day. Millions have fled the fighting in Ukraine, adding to the latest annual figures released by the UN. In total, close to 90 million people are considered forcibly displaced across the planet. After years of relative stability, the figure has surged, more than doubling in the past decade. The number officially seeking asylum surpassed 4.5 million in 2021. Germany was the EU country that received the highest number of new applications. Turkey hosts more forcibly displaced people than any other country, with more than 3.8 million. Across the world, just 4 countries have taken in almost a third of all refugees. War and persecution remain the cause of displacement. Until the invasion of Ukraine, which isn't included in this latest report, the enduring Syrian conflict was the principal source of flight from fighting. Almost half of all refugees came from a handful of countries. In addition to Syria, the list includes South Sudan, Myanmar and Afghanistan, with more than 88% of Afghan refugees hosted in Pakistan and Iran. The report also gives special consideration to the situation in Venezuela, which the UNHCR categorizes as the second largest external displacement crisis in the world, with some 6 million refugees and migrants from Venezuela located worldwide.
Okay, well, that's it from myself and the team. Take care. Bye-bye.